Hey y'all, welcome back for another episode of Talk to Not At. Now I'm your host, Abby, for those who are new, and the show is produced by the Debate Boutique Network. So this week we're going to dive into a topic that geographically hits a lot closer to home for me than I expected or realized when I first heard about the incident. So I myself am born and raised in Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I'm a Michigander through and through, spent the majority of my life there, and only have had several years of living out of state, whether it was in Baltimore or here where I am now in Houston, Texas. But anyway, growing up in Michigan, the ability to defend and also perform the Second Amendment right is very intrinsic to the culture there. Now, even though we're a northern state, some of y'all might be surprised to hear that Michigan has some very intense, more conservative locations than what might be expected. But in all actuality, growing up back home, it was not uncommon for tons of people to go hunting all the time, for smaller schools when first day of hunting season happened to actually shut down school so all the kids could go hunting with their family, right? So it wasn't like people were very unfamiliar with guns. Now on top of it, you all may have heard during COVID, the state where people stormed their state capitol building and they had giant rifles and guns and were threatening to kidnap the governor. Yeah, that was Michigan. Yeah, that's my home state, right? So the culture in Michigan is very much, we got the right to our guns and you can't take that away from us. And not only do we have the right, but so do our children. So I think you all can kind of tell where I might be going with this, and that we are going to today talk about the Oxford High School shooting. So before we dive into the topic, I just want to give a trigger warning because this is a really traumatizing, sad, hard topic to talk about. So I just want to put that out there that that's going to be our focus for this episode. Now, we just talked about the culture of Michigan, but before we really dive into, what happened that day in our upload portion of what is it that we want to really break down about this moment of violence, is that I first want to talk about some of the leading moments that took place prior to the actual moment of violence that happened at Oxford High School. Now, Oxford High School is located in a suburban area of Detroit. It's not as diverse as you may think it is when I say the term Detroit, because again, emphasis on more suburban area. Now, this area is located in Oakland County, and the school that it took place at, there was actually several moments leading up to the day of the shooting that really kind of showed that this moment was possible. Now, I'm not saying it was on school counselors or teachers to be able to prevent this event, but I just first want to talk about some of the recent facts that we've kind of learned about this case prior to what actually occurred on that date. So the Oakland School District, or Oxford High School, has been complying with officials with the investigation of this case, and it actually turns out that the day prior to the incident that happened, the culprit of this moment of violence or these murders, Ethan Crumbley, had actually been addressed by his teacher first for looking up gun ammunition on his phone during class. Now, he was able to kind of justify this by being oh, it's very common for me and my family to go hunting. So I'm sorry, I won't look it up on school property, but I was just Googling it on my phone because, we hunt. That's what we do out here. So the teachers were okay, that's a justifiable answer. I mean, that's not culturally uncommon based on where we're located. But they advised him not to do that on school property, which for some of us as we're listening to it, okay, now that we know what happened, that's red flag number one. And mind you, this is the day before the event occurred. So in all due respect, there are definitely, most likely, a lot more telling moments about where this boy's mental state was at prior to that actual day. Now we get to the morning of the actual shooting that took place. And Ethan Crumbley again is approached by teachers because they found this horrifying picture sitting on his desk where he drew a very graphic image, and it includes a gun, and it included someone who was harmed and the words "help me." So immediately they're like, hey kid, you gotta come to the office with us. We need to talk about this because this ain't it. So they brought him to the office and they called his parents in, and his parents were like, okay, yeah, sorry that he did that, but we're not taking him home. And they're like, okay, but y'all need to put him in counseling in the next 48 hours. And his parents are like, yeah, whatever, but we're not taking him home. Now again, school counselors, like, they're taught, you know, how to work mostly with students in terms of the training that they receive for that specific job. So their focus is on, like, does the student have the right based on prior history to be, you know, asked to vacate the premises? Is there a likelihood that the student is about to harm themselves? There's all these litmus questions that a counselor must go through to decide if, in terms of school policy, do they have the right to remove this student from the campus? And based on this situation and this drawing with Ethan having no prior incidents, no, they didn't. So Ethan simply returned to class. But what makes this moment more horrifying is that the entire time Ethan had his backpack with him, he had the weapon that he used to commit this moment of violence sitting in his backpack in the office with his parents, teachers, and counselors. Now, the only people who I'm gonna say are responsible for maybe recognizing the possibility of this are his parents. Why? Well, it's his parents' gun. It's his parents' weapon. I mean, they left it in the house, not in a locked box, which you're really not supposed to do, especially if you have children. They had received a call the previous day that he was looking up inappropriate content, and instead of calling back, they just ignored it. And in fact, they actually texted their son instead of responding to the school based on the call they had received the day before. And what the mom had texted his son, which, y'all, this part was just wild to me, was the mother texted her son, and I quote, LOL, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught. Excuse me, ma'am? No. So what you're telling me is that it's okay for a child in your mind to sit here and start looking up things that could be a warning of something not being right, of something that may lead up to them harming themselves or others. No, just flat out, clearly, that is not just a red flag about Ethan, but a red flag about his mother, Jennifer. Now, we get up to the time that the actual incident took place, and this simply happened just moments after he had left the office in the meeting with his parents on the day that his parents refused to take him home. During passing time, Ethan decided to unload his weapon on fellow classmates and ended up murdering 4 of his classmates. Now, the victims of this incident were Madison Baldwin, who was 17 years old, Tate Meyer, who was 16, Hannah St. Juliana, who was 14, and Justin Schilling, who was 17. So it was said that he did this during passing time. The moment that a shot was fired, the hallways cleared, everyone barricaded themselves, and he wasn't able to access any of the rooms. So thankfully, you know, the teachers were able to really use the training that they've received to protect the students, which is sad that we live in that day and age. But in terms of this, since clearly state policies and the culture of the world we live in isn't changing quick enough to prevent this from happening, is a blessing that they were able to protect more students from being harmed. But at the same time, you know, it's devastating that 4 kids lost their lives for something that, as simple as a parent just taking their kid home because they're like, hey, we kind of need to talk about this, could have been prevented that day. Now, because of this, because of the parents' response, the parents' lack of action, or I should say lack of response, both of the parents have been charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. So James and Jennifer Crumbly have also been charged as associates to these murders. On top of Ethan being tried as an adult for several cases of first-degree murder, more, other charges as well, on top of an act of terrorism, which I don't think is an incorrect statement to make, because at some point, when do we start changing the caliber for addressing these situations? Because the reality is, this is normal in American culture. School shootings are a normalized thing that happen way more often than they should. And when I say normal, I mean to the point where so far in 2021, there have been 222 school shootings. And there's only 180 days in an entire school calendar year. So there is more than one shooting happening somewhere in the nation a day. That's normal. And that's disturbing. And that's sad. But I guess where I kind of want to go with this is that right now a lot of the debates are revolving around, should teachers have access to guns? Do we need to restrict our access to guns? Should we limit the age that people can have access to guns? How can we enforce some type of gun control? And I don't think that it means that, we don't have some type of gun control, we don't still have this conversation. But I believe there is a much more insidious cultural trend that is happening behind the scenes, that is mystified by this entire debate, that makes it so that way these moments, these events are more likely to happen in the United States. There's something about our culture that changes the psychology of not only a larger sphere in terms of adults and politics and collective groups, but trickles down to influence the psychology of young children. And I think that's where we need to start focusing some of our conversation on, to dissect, okay, what's going on behind the scenes? Why is it in the US that this happens when there's other countries that have very lax gun laws, yet we don't see these same moments of violence happening? What's going on? What's the correlation between the statistics, the demographics, and the US culture itself? But before we get into that kind of dissecting part, before we upload ourselves into the conversation, I want to take a moment for all of us to, just think about maybe where are our thoughts when it comes to the debate on gun policy. Where do we think that these events are occurring, or why these events are occurring? But especially to take a moment and pay some respects, take a moment of silence to the 4 students that had recently lost their lives to a senseless act of violence. So let's just take a moment and breathe. Okay, y'all, welcome back. I hope we all had a moment, to just upload ourselves in the conversation, but also to pay respect to the victims of the Oxford High School shooting, as well as, if we need to pause the video to kind of think about what's our view on the topic, where do we think we're going with this conversation, feel free to take the time to do so, because we're really about to try to connect what is happening in current culture to some historical and psychological things that are also going on, right? So I just want to make sure, we all took a moment to really upload ourselves into this conversation. But to pick up where we left off, right? So I really made this bold statement here saying, yeah, there's something more insidious happening. It's not just about someone's upbringing, it's not just about gun control, but there's a deeper conversation, and these smaller political moments are mystifying the reality of what the situation is. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the reason that these types of events happen is due to white supremacy, is due to settler colonialism, is due to toxic masculinity. And let me break it down why that's kind of the narrative or understanding that I have. Now, first, before I get into like connecting some of those larger pieces, I want to talk about some research that psychologists have done in response to the increasing number of these types of events. Now, psychologists, especially in the later 2000s, earlier 2000s, I guess, but 2009 to 2015, during this time period, there was a huge psychological push to understand why the hell does this keep happening, and why is it not just happening, but it's happening more often. And a term was coined by psychologists to explain this type of event based on the psychology of the individual who is performing these acts of violence. And that term that was coined was called an autogenic massacre. So I'm going to kind of use that term now to refer to school shootings as an autogenic massacre. So what does that term mean, right? Because I know before me diving into this research, I had never heard of that term a day in my life. But I guess an autogenic massacre, again, was coined by psychologists to really explain the psychology and the actions done during these moments of violence. So the psychology behind it is that when a male feels that they are unable to assert themselves as an alpha male, right, to claim public space, to assert themselves on the pecking order of society, then it turns or creates conflict with these biological instincts to be able to assert one's own identity, right? And I guess in terms of biology, it's tied to the desire to self-preserve. And self-preservation does not just mean live in that moment, but it also means to pass on one's lineage. So when we think about this in the concept of students, when a male student feels that they're unable to have that recognition by their peers that will allow for them to create a lineage both in that moment, in that time, in that space, but also in terms of having the possibility to interact with people that they may be attracted to, then it creates this instinctual frustration and need to assert that dominancy, right? So then becomes the possibility for people who are dealing with that psychological and instinctual disconnect to engage in autogenic massacres. Now, I want to quick preempt that the language that we're about to talk about in this is it's very heteronormative in the concept that it's really talking about cis heterosexual men and cis heterosexual women. But we'll also kind of dive into that a little bit more as we go on too, of why the use of that language may also be important to understanding the psychology behind it. Now, this snippet is from Harrison and Bowers in 2010, an article that was written about autogenic massacres. And I think that they really summarize in this kind of couple sentences what they're trying to get at as to what an autogenic massacre means. Now, they argue that these individuals may perpetuate horrific crimes based on an evolutionary compulsion. Pause, I want to put a pin in evolutionary, but to continue, in an evolutionary compulsion to take action against a perceived threat to their social status as males. The strength or weakness of their social status among male competitors may influence the choice of the selected females around them. From an evolutionary standpoint, their goal is to successfully form relationships, procreate, and further their lineage with these selected females. So, it's really using kind of this biology that, we see first of all, we're humans. We are animals, right? We do have biological instincts. But it's talking about, okay, so there's these human nature before we've come into the social contract, right? These human natural instincts that certain men will have to be able to assert their dominance, and that it's not just something that, just poof happened, but it's evolved over time. It's changed and evolved based on the current political climate or modernity or what is needed at the time, right? So it's evolutionary, but also that it's not just unique to humans. I mean, if we look at it from a more general, just animal biology aspect, in every aspect of the animal kingdom, we see competition when it comes for mating. No matter what sex are the species that are having that competition, we see competition for resources. It's just part of, natural selection. Now, that's not an excuse for where I'm going with this, but I just want to make sure that we're recognizing the I want to say heteronormative language that is used in terms of males versus females. And then I also want to make sure that we're recognizing the evolutionary aspect as well as we continue on to this conversation. So where I want to go now is I want us to pull back from a conversation we had several episodes ago at the beginning of our series, right? When we're talking about toxic masculinity and this idea of the Oedipus or Oedipal complex in psychoanalysis. Now, we've talked about psychoanalysis a few times, and if you all have been kind of following this series or just really familiar with psychology on your own, you might be like, oh my goodness, this explanation sounds like a kind of biological, watering down understanding or analysis of what psychoanalysis or psychoanalytical theory is. And because that's exactly true. This theory pulls from the autogenic massacre theory pulls from psychoanalysis to help explain why these moments of violence happen. So now let's connect the two, right? So psychoanalysis, again, just as a refresher, is this theory to explain the ways that we ourselves navigate the reality of the world we live in. So again, when we are born as, children, as babies, we are born with these natural instincts of self-preservation. We have these desires and these claims, and that is the raw human instinct, which is represented by your id. Now, when we recognize that, oh snap, we are a part of a larger society, that there's a social contract, that there are moral codes that we must follow, we attempt to reach this superhuman or super ego where we are the most profound moral higher beings that we possibly can be. Yet to be that moral higher being really clashes with these instinctual desires. So, for example, again, if let's say I'm sitting here, I'm like, I'm really thirsty, and I see my friend has a glass of water. If my raw instinctual desire, my id just took over, I wouldn't care about my friend. I'd just take that water and drink it for myself. And if I needed to be violent to be able to have that resource, I would. Now, obviously, my moral code says, that's your homie, chill out. You can't act that way. That's disrespectful, girl. So I'd be like, okay, let me just, let her have her water because that's her. She deserves it. I'm not even going to ask. So what we try to do is navigate these two conflicting realities, right? Which actually shapes the lived experiences we have. So I might tell my friend, okay, hey, I'm kind of thirsty. Could I have a sip of your water, please? Or could you help me get a glass of water for myself? So that might be a way that I may navigate the moral higher being and my raw instinctual desires. So in terms of the desire to, claim space, when we think of the Oedipus complex or Oedipal complex, we recognize that there's this desire for the male child to one day replace the figure of the father in terms of becoming the toxic man, the dominating man, the man who, has the ability to assert themselves in the world, to protect, to provide, to procreate, to pass on that lineage that only a man can pass on, right? Because children take the last names of their fathers, right? So the man has this responsibility to perform these certain tasks, but it's not even just a responsibility, it's a instinctual right. Now, we talked, before about authors like Fanon and how they help us understand that these desires and the reality and these, codes or moral codes of society that we have are influenced by the actual reality of the community that we're born into. And that reality is that we live in a world governed by white supremacy, settler colonialism, heteronormativity, right, transphobia, all these forms of isms and oppressions that structure who has the ability to actually affirm or to project their desires into the world, right? And also whose desires are what desires. If you have the desire to be the moral high being, we talked before about how that moral code is structured or founded on white society. And it's founded in opposition to blackness, right? We talked a little bit about the plantation and how for the master to still be viewed as humane, even though they were inflicting mass and gratuitous forms of violence onto the slaves thus couldn't be human. They needed to be criminal. They needed to be something that wasn't viewed in the judiciary system, so that way the master still could be pure. They still could be humane. They still could be seen as beautiful in the eyes of God. So our moral codes themselves are structured by white supremacy, settler colonialism, and like we talked about, all these isms. So that kind of pulls us back to how I addressed in the Terrison and Bowers paragraph, that gendered language that we're seeing, that heteronormative language that we're seeing, right? Because they're talking about how males have this desire to mate with females, yet we also, in terms of psychoanalysis, we're like, okay, so we recognize that the nuclear family complex plays a key role in understanding psychoanalytical theory and how cis, heterosexual, white, able-bodied men are the ones who have the most ability to affirm their will into the world, to assert their dominance, right? And how there's these instinctual desires that are founded in privilege, right? That get bolstered, as well as these moral codes that, again, are founded in privilege, that make it so when there's tension between what their instincts say, hey, this is my right, I have the right to claim this space, but also their moral code of like, oh, but society says that's not okay. When there's all this intense friction happening, moments of violence and lashing out occur. Now, I'm going to kind of make it like a more holistic, pull on some more history type of connection here, right? Before we focus it back down into the case of autogenic massacres or school shootings. So when we think of European white dominancy throughout history, there have been moments of violence throughout all the attempts to assert a political, social hierarchy. There have been moments of violence that are more intense than any other moments of violence throughout history. So when we think of slavery, there was slavery, right, within different continents and countries. There's been slavery that's existed throughout centuries. Yet when it came to the divine right of the white man to control the world, there was a cultural shift where slavery, the desires of slavery and domination, the desires of eradicating other populations, no longer just was, about having profitability, but it became something that was more insidious. And it was about asserting a type of what is the norm, right? A type of white supremacy that would eradicate, that would inflict consistent violence onto these other populations. So when Europeans in the United States began the slave trade, right, gratuitous violence was intrinsic to that process, something that had never been intrinsic to slavery before. So when I say gratuitous violence, I mean violence for the sake of violence. I'm talking about, sorry that we're a little graphic, but the lynching, the unnecessary raping, the beating, the dismemberment, the horrific acts of violence that happen on the plantation for no reason, simply to affirm that this is your place in society and this is my place, and I can do whatever I want to do to you because I have this desire to completely eradicate your species, but also to affirm my own morality at the same time, right? And that clashing of I need to be moral and I have this desire to eradicate you creates these intensified moments of violence. Now let's look at colonization, right? There has been wars again throughout history. I'm not saying things have been peaceful, but when it came to the U.S., there was an unprecedented type of genocide that was inflicted to the indigenous population, right? Like, I mean, to the point of it just didn't it spilled over to their resources. It spilled over to their ways of life. It was a complete attempt to erase and eradicate these communities and populations from the very existence, while at the same time, again, affirming their own moral code. We can look at a more current context when we look at wars. Let's talk about, the nuclear bombs that were created, right? That they were dropped on Japan, yet there were 2 bombs dropped. And also, it wasn't that deep to create these type of nuclear weapons. In fact, the scientists who were forced to create these weapons, or some chose, some were forced, but were haunted in terms of, they created this legacy of nuclear weapons, and some of them were forced against their will. But they weren't necessary tools to be able to win that war, but rather it was necessary to reestablish, don't test the United States, okay? Because we are the top of the world order and everything else falls beneath us. So we will show you in the most extreme way, but we'll defend that this intensified moment of violence falls into our moral code because it was necessary. It was necessary to defend the American rights, the white right, the white male right, to dominate, control, and not have any competition in the social pecking order. Now, this insidious type of psychology that is influenced by structuralism doesn't just affect global events, right? But we see it. We see it consistently throughout history, and consistently only throughout history when it's tied to white domination, white male domination. But that trickles down, because it's a collective mindset. It's a collective action that says that you're entitled to this. This is your, God-given, divine, white, privileged right to be able to claim space, assert your will, and to always be at the top. So when there comes times where white children, and especially white male children, because again, the statistics show that it is white, cis, heterosexual, able-bodied male children, yes, able-bodied, because we sit here and want to always be like, it's like mental illness, and we stigmatize mental illnesses in the name of protecting white supremacy. But it is this demographic that has not just the highest rate, but 80 to 90% of the highest rate of these school shootings, and are unique to these types of school shootings. I'm gonna keep it a buck. You don't hear Black or Latinx people just on the daily walking into a school and shooting anyone and everyone that they can just for the sake of it. You don't hear of minority adults walking into a children's elementary school and targeting students. That's just the facts. I'm not saying, things have never happened before, but I'm talking about what is normalized. And it's normalized for white, male, cis, able-bodied children to perform these acts of violence. Because it is also normalized that we live in a society that says you got this God-given privilege right to claim space, to assert your dominance, to be at the top of the pecking order. And when that instinct, that natural desire to claim what is biologically their given right clashes with this reality of the experiences that they're living, of this stifling of their ability to just aggressively and assert their toxic masculinity and claim the space they want to claim, eventually enough of that energy builds up, that friction keeps happening, and then sometimes individuals explode and release that energy in something called an autogenic massacre. So what I'm really trying to say this is, to really kind of just totalize it all, is that white supremacy, settler colonialism, and other isms, they don't just structure historical events, but they change the psychology of individuals as well. They change what we think we have the right to do and what we don't think that we have the right to do, right? They change the ways that we perform our everyday lives. They change our raw instinctual desires to the point that it becomes a recipe for unjustifiable forms of violence at the hands, in the name of claiming space for white supremacy. And even if that violence is inflicted on other people in the white community, that doesn't change the fact that it's about an assertion of an individual's right to claim space, because that's what our society is structured as. That's what our society tells white supremacy or white children that they have the right to have. We can't ignore the historical context and the ways that over time, evolutionarily, the ways that our culture changes is going to influence the evolution of the mindset, the evolution of psychology, the evolution of the ways that our community networks. And that trickles down and influences the psychology of children as well. And even, if you're like, okay, I hear you, Abby, but I'm not almost there. Let's look back at Jennifer's comment to her son, where she said, LOL, I'm not mad at you. You just have to learn not to get caught. Let's think about that in terms of psychoanalysis. I'm not mad at you. You're not mad because you are affirming that your son has the right to claim certain spaces, right? It's inappropriate to be looking at ammunition at school, but you're saying, no, my son has the right because he is a dominant masculine figure. You can't ignore that intrinsic nature that he has to be a masculine person, to be engaging in some form of type of aggressive assertion of violence, even if it's just through looking up ammunition. You have that right. No, I'm mad that you have to learn not to get caught. She said you have to learn to not get caught because she still recognized there's still moral codes that structure our society, honey. So you have the right to have these instinctual desires, but you just have to hide them from the reality of the world that we live in. That you still have to try to strive to be this moral higher being, even though we recognize you still have these desires. Just stifle them. You're not wrong for having those thoughts, but just don't let the moral superior code catch you. And that's when that friction happens. That's what we're talking about, is that affirmation of these desires, the recognition of these desires, right? And then that moral code that says you can't do that. So eventually it's just like, okay, F the moral code. I have all this pent up energy. I'm going to just disrupt this way. So I'm just saying, y'all, it's deeper question than just gun control. It's a question of the very psychology of our nation and the way that it influences younger minds. But that note, I guess we hit so what's up next? Like, dang, Abby, we really broke it down. Now I'm like, is there shit that we can do about this? Yes, there still are things that we can do. Yes, I still believe that we need to have some form of restriction when it comes to gun control. I mean, I still believe that, certain individuals should not be able to own guns, especially when it comes to people who have histories of violence, right? Especially domestic violence. Or when it comes to how should parents have to, protect or put aside weapons so that way they're not accessible to children. And then holding parents accountable when they don't follow these laws or rules that will allow for acts of violence to happen, whether it's within the home or in the public sphere. But I also think that we need to start doing a better job in establishing with children that they don't have the right to claim everybody else's space. You have the right, to exist in your own space. And I'm not talking about black kids and brown kids. I'm not talking about the oppressed children who already have their space stolen from them. I'm talking about we need to do better with establishing with white children that, listen, it's not all Gucci Tucci for you. You don't have the right to perpetuate more acts of white supremacy, even though you may not necessarily understand all the details behind it. Because there are ways that we see this logic being perpetuated by children. And I'm not saying, children are sitting here being like evil little children that are just trying to, harm other people. No, I'm not saying it's something that's conscious. It's something that is subconscious, that our culture just over time teaches that there is this right, even if we don't understand that that's what's being done. But when we think about the doll experiment, right? White children, I don't think they sat here and were like, I'm going to go out of my way and just be mean today. Now, I'm not saying some kids do that, but they had this affirmation of the white doll, and there was a disregard or this disgust towards the black doll. Because that's an example, again, of children's psychology being influenced by the culture of the society we live in. So we need to do a better job of uneducating that, right? Of allowing everyone to be recognized that we're all equal and nobody has the right to claim more space than what they should be allowed to. And starting younger can help prevent children from growing up and building up so much friction that they eventually lash out in these harmful ways. Because at the end of the day, white supremacy is not going anywhere quickly, but it needs to be addressed on all fronts, not just on a political front, if we're going to sit here and be able to prevent some of these types of senseless acts of violence from occurring. Well, on that note, y'all, I just want to say thank you all so much for tuning in with me again for another episode. In all honesty, this is one of my most interesting conversations that I was able to be a part of, because I learned so much when I was doing some research on autogenic massacres, as well as diving deeper again into psychoanalysis and some instances that are currently happening. And then I kind of recognized, too, for myself that, there are more fronts that we need to fight white supremacy on. And it can be hard because you're like, well, they're just kids. Yeah, but we're teaching kids. That's the responsibility part, right? Is that parents or teachers or culture is normalizing trends with children, that when they have the ability to assert acts of violence or affirm moments of white supremacy, then it happens. And I'm not saying that it's a harsh teaching or a tough love, right? But rather it's just a recognition of there's still more fronts that we need to start addressing white supremacy on. So I really hope you all enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Please do not hesitate to contact me with any questions, thoughts, or continue the conversation. You can hit me up on the email. You can hit me up on the IG page. And on that note as well, y'all, make sure you subscribe. Follow the IG page, okay? Make sure you hit that subscribe button and that notification button down below, so that way when our next episode comes out, y'all are going to be able to just immediately jump in the conversation with us. But thank you all so much again for tuning in today, and I can't wait to see y'all next time. But remember, stay safe and stay healthy.